Good evening, everybody. My name is Jacqueline Sawyer, and I'm the VP of Education and Engagement here at the National Building Museum. Tonight's program is presented by the Darwina L. Neal Cultural Landscape Fund. Darwina Neal was a tireless advocate and supporter of the National Building Museum for decades. In 2016, she made a significant contribution to help fill a need in the museum's program offerings by creating this fund. Darwina wanted to ensure that the public appreciated the importance of historic and internationally significant cultural landscapes. Tonight marks the first program since Darwina's passing in September of last year. We are immensely honored that the program supported by the Darwina L. Neal Cultural Landscape Fund will continue at the National Building Museum as a lasting legacy of a wonderfully accomplished, generous, and dedicated person. This program is also part of the museum's fall event series, Intersections, where diversity, equity, and design meet. Our co-sponsor, DC NOMA, is represented by their president, Reggie Truxton, who is here today, so we want to acknowledge them. Intersections is also part of our signature series, Equity in the Built Environment. Equity is presented with the support of the studio's architecture and Arab. For tonight's program, we ask how preservation of landscapes can strengthen our understanding of our shared history. We will examine how the landscapes that Harriet Tubman experienced have been changed, adapted, and preserved by interpretive choices. We are thrilled to have an excellent panel who has worked at two key sites related to Harriet Tubman's life, in Church Creek, Maryland, and in Auburn, New York. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Kaye Whitehead. Kaye Whitehead, an associate professor of communication, African and African American studies at Loyola University in Maryland, is a three-time New York Emmy-nominated documentary filmmaker and an award-winning radio host. Of Today with Dr. Kaye. She is also the founder and director of the Carson Institute of Race, Peace, and Social Justice, and the founding executive director of the Emily Francis Davis Center for Education, Research, and Culture. Her scholarship examines ways race, class, and gender coalesce in American classrooms, as well as in the political and social environments. And I would also like to say Kaye has been a great friend of mine for almost 20 years. I met Kaye when I was 22 and starting my education life. She also was 22 and has not aged a day. And so much of the path that has been laid for me in my professional career started in Kaye's classroom. So it is wonderful to have her here. So without further ado, Kaye Whitehead.
Good evening. So Harriet Tubman was a rabble-rouser. She stood up for what she believed in, and she taught us how to stand up straight in a crooked world. And she did it time and time again. I'm always excited whenever there are presentations about Harriet Tubman because there's so much more to learn about her, to study about her, and really to find ways to moderate conversations about her to both those who've come before us and those who are coming after us. So I'm really excited about coming down tonight for this conversation. I want to begin by introducing Chris Elcock, an associate principal at GWWO Architects. He has focused his career on creating impactful and engaging places for people to learn, to gather, including visitor centers, education buildings, and performance halls. Mr. Elcock also serves on Maryland's Coast Smart Council, which focuses on developing criteria for the design of state structures that are vulnerable to sea level rise and flooding. I'm excited about your presentation. Come on up, Chris.
And thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm assuming everyone can hear me. So I am Chris Elcock from GWWO. We're located in Baltimore. And this project has been quite an experience and one that I'm proud to talk about on behalf of many Marylanders, designers, engineers of color, women in particular, who have been proud to work on this project, all giving of their best to create this facility. The project that I'm going to talk about is a partnership park. So what was really unusual here was that the visitor center is on a site that both was funded by the state of Maryland and also by the National Park Service. So it was one of those very interesting and pioneer opportunities where we had to please not only one, but two state agencies. I'll take you back to July 7th, 2008. This is when our firm had to compete for the job. So this was my first introduction to the site. And it was 17 acres of an abandoned farm. People said, well, not much there, huh? The other thing was that a couple miles down the road, there was this marker. This marker said, it talked about Moses of her people, and most people thought that that marker was where she was born. And that wasn't true. So we got this site that was an abandoned farm, and we had a marker a couple miles off that wasn't quite accurate. And so we had a lot of research and a lot of work to do. The other thing is that I want you to remember this image because it comes back into play a little later on, because we have an open field, we have woods to the north, and there are people saying that there wasn't much to interpret. So this is the site from Google. I'm trying to get it, right? And this is where the marker was. This is actually where she was born. So she was born here, she was moved here in her early life. And then this is the Bucktown store, which if you know anything about the history of Harriet Tubman, you know that she was hit by a weight at the Bucktown store. So we knew that we could authenticate that. At least then we knew that this land, this area was her reality. The other thing that we were fortunate was that the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge and all of the environs and all of the views around here have been preserved over the years. And so we had a landscape and we had an environment that was pretty authentic or pretty close to what she would have seen and what she would have known. And so that was really where we began our inspiration. This is sort of the site in more detail, and that was the brief that we were given. So, there are the fields. There wasn't a house that was on there that was actually dismantled and sold for $1. But we had 17.3 acres of flat land to work with. Some of the principal or some the other influences that I'll mention, canals were really important in this region because that was how timber was taken from the woods and then down to the coast for shipbuilding. We were really interested in the edges, that is the clearing, these edges that were created when fields would give way to the natural landscape. Just the idea of, this is a shot in the woods, and how could you even tell where you were going if you were thinking about escaping? The waterways, again, play really central into this dialogue. And then one of the things I learned was that when you have acres and acres of flat land, these swales became really important because that's the only way to get water to drain off of the soil then to actually have the crops and grow fields. So these were some of the landscape influences that were important to us. Architecture-wise, if you look through history or even the present day or at that time, I would just say simple agrarian forms. And then finally, the last major influence would be the story. And so just the idea, understanding that you didn't wake up one day and just decide to head north. Like it was never a linear route. And then in fact, when the Fugitive Slave Act came into being, then a lot of times people, her routes, sometimes she would backtrack just to throw the slave catchers off. So just these sort of understandings. This is a landscape architecture lecture, but I was told that it's at the National Building Museum, and so I couldn't escape without talking a little bit about the architecture, so I'll go through that very quickly. So the building that you see here is separated into two segments. The arrival and all of the present day features happen underneath these two volumes. And so this is a wood finished sort of barn proportions that you would expect to see in the Eastern Shore. We tell the story of Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad Maryland Eastern Shore context underneath these 3 volumes. And the number of volumes was inspired directly from her story, because the reason why she came back was because she wanted to get the rest of her family. She had one sister who was sold south and never heard from again. You know, there were some who were able to escape. She got her parents out, and then some that she never got. She never got Rachel. Rachel died. And so it represents the 3 fates of African Americans at that time. Either you were sold south, you may have remained, or you may have gone north and never been heard from again. And so that's just a little bit about it. And these 3 stories, the 3 volumes are connected by this sort of northbound curtain wall. And so we do a lot with trying to allow people to realize where they are and where north is when they learn about this story. The final thing I'll say is that the panels are, it was deliberate that we abstracted these volumes because, again, we were telling a story. And we wanted a way to, memorialize those fates. The other thing is that we, in the end, zinc was chosen as the material because the gray would dull over time, and then if people or anyone would scratch it, it would actually patina and self-heal. And we were really interested in that idea of dulling and self-healing being a metaphor for the country's attitude towards slavery. Just a few shots of the building. This is it from the main road. You can see when I say present day, I'm talking about things that when you first go to a visitor center that you need to do. So the restrooms, orientation, there's a library, the gift shop, all that happens kind of in this volume. And then we do all of the learning over here. We celebrate that threshold. So this is the journey, the visitor's journey on the Underground Railroad. We use the Blackwater Wildlife Refuge as part of the interpretation. I'm trying to go backwards here. There we go. And so what I wanted to point out was that we tell the story and we leverage the views so people can understand when she was here on the Eastern Shore then what she may have seen. This is just a shot north. And then what we do with the building, the last thing I'll say is that rather than leave you north, we actually ask all the visitors then to come back south again. And if they wonder why at first, but then they realize that she came back for others. And so we ask visitors to do the same. All right, so here we are on the site. I'll spend a little bit more time here. And north now is in this direction. And so the park is, as I mentioned, 17.3 acres. We've got all the exhibits held in this volume. The administration of the park happens over here, and there is also a picnic pavilion that we sort of push as far west as we could because it was sort of a little different in terms of its use. We bring people from the southernmost point of the site that we could. We take them north, and we present them with this view. If they drop off passengers, that's fine. They come back, they go back again, and they gather here, and then they go into the exhibit hall. This northern view is articulated in a couple of ways. First of all, this area is always kept as a lawn, and so it reinforces this idea that to the north are some woods. And what we're trying to do, and what you will learn as you go through the exhibits and you come back out, is we're trying to place the visitor in the mindset of the time. Here you are in an open field, and you could go north at any time that you wanted to. But slavery, slavery is an invisible construct. And so there are a lot of reasons why you would not necessarily take that journey on your own. The other thing is that we because of the fact that the site was empty, we had to, and they wanted a memorial garden. What we decided was that rather than have this sort of stiff experience or this just a simple statue or something sort of really tight and geometrical, that because this was an outdoor story, that we would ask visitors to think about and contemplate Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad while on your own sort of small journey. And so we asked visitors then to take this loop. There is a short loop and then there's a longer one. Either, both of them get you back to the same place. But we incorporate a couple things like these decision-making points. So you get to this point and do you go left or do you go right? again, if you're on the Underground Railroad, you'd have to make these kinds of decisions. The other thing is that as you're traveling from this open lawn into this zone, you'll notice it's rendered differently, because this is where then we change the height. And so we're dealing with meadows and ornamental grasses that will take you from 4 inches in the lawn to anywhere between 2 and 3 feet. The advantage, or the nice thing about that then, is that the grass is also blowing the winds. You get these ideas of movement. And as you're traveling from areas of being very exposed to areas of being concealed, and then as you're looping, you'll see other figures in the distance. And so then you begin to imagine other figures on their own journey on the Underground Railroad, and then think a little bit about the fact that, there are other people who could help you with their cause, or they could actually be reporting you as an escapee as well. And so you think about the figures who are not with you a little bit differently. You can take the small loop, or you can take the long loop. And either which way, one of the other things that we try to do is, as we bring you out of these areas of concealment, then we try to incorporate some of the themes. So the drainage swales, which are handling some of the water runoff, we bring you quite close to, so then you can think about and remember that she had an assignment here on the Eastern Shore trapping muskrats. And then ultimately, as you take the longer loop, then we again evoke a pond image, so that again, it just connects you to, this is sort of a smaller version of the larger Blackwater Wildlife Refuge to the east. So this is from your arrival point, and you can see the low grasses and that view to the north. So when you first arrive, you say, okay, grass, I get it, maybe that's north. But after the interpretive experience, then we hope that you will see it differently. We expect that you'll see it differently. Here is the first year of trying to grow this meadow. I brought this slide in because this is true to the design effect. So we thought that, how incredibly powerful. We would just have this pathway. People would start to, we have all of the tall grasses going quite close to the visitor, and that people would begin to feel that they're being concealed, and they would begin to enjoy this experience and think a lot about being on their own Underground Railroad journey. What we heard after the first year was that the bugs are jumping on folks, and they didn't like that so much. So we had to make an adjustment to that plan. So we incorporated a mow strip, okay? And so we have a little bit of relief between the path and the taller grasses. You see the trees trying to grow in, it's gonna take a little bit of time. This is also a shot from a couple years ago, but you can begin to see then that we can still get the same effect, but maybe at least now I think people can see the bugs before they start to hop, as you see the grasshoppers at least. And then here's a shot of that decision-making, one of those decision-making points. All roads kind of lead to the same place, but at least then we're able to layer in a bit of the experience without being too disorienting to the visitor. Here's a shot of the shallow pond that we created, and this picture plays heavily in the story because this is the type of marshland that she would have been assigned to trapping, relieving the muskrat traps. I'll mention one last thing. A large part of the program was because we're fortunate that the center's visited quite a bit, but there was a large program or requirement for overflow parking, and we did not want to create or provide a heavily paved surface. What you're looking at is a mix that is stone and grass, a custom mix that we devised for stone and grass seeds. And the whole idea is that when you're looking at it at this angle, it doesn't read like a sea of gravel, but you still get a sense of green across the landscape. I always end talks about this project with these lines, and I'll read this with you and then I'll pass it off. So here at our site, Harriet Tubman was born here in 1822. Enslaved from birth, she endured backbreaking labor and harsh treatment at the hands of her enslavers for 27 years before she escaped. Yet among these necks of land and tidal marshes, Tubman also became physically and spiritually strong and found deep comfort in her family, community, and faith. Shaped by this place, where enslaved and free African Americans once lived together side by side, Tubman grew into a woman who repeatedly risked her life to free dozens of people from bondage. This was her homeland. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really love how the person I was sitting by when she heard the story about the bugs said, that's such a first world problem. So I know we're going to have a good time when we get to the Q&A portion, because I thought the same thing. I'm like, the bugs are getting in my way. I can't get to freedom because of the bugs. So we'll talk about that during the Q&A. I want to invite up Deanna Mitchell, and she has served the past 5 years as superintendent of the Harriet Tubman National Historical Park in Church Creek, Maryland. She has served a total of 34 years in the federal government, having also worked for the U.S. Naval Service Warfare Center and the Department of Transportation before joining the Park Service in 2005. Thank you for your service, and we welcome you up.
Well, good evening, everyone. Chris, I tell you, you are a hard act to follow. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for coming out and spending time with us, because I couldn't think of a better person to just talk about and share information about other than Harriet Tubman. So I won't be very long. I know I have 10 minutes, so I will go ahead and get started here. So just a little bit about Harriet Tubman. For those of you who may not know, she, as Chris mentioned, she was born into slavery in 1822. And she lived a very long life. She lived till 1913. But she was born Araminta Ross. And her family and friends would call her Minty. That was her nickname. And so she changed her name once she emancipated herself in 1849 to honor her mother, because her mother's name was Harriet. And she was referred to as Rit, her nickname. And she was also known as the most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad. She was referred to as Moses, the Moses of her time. And we're talking about someone who was only 5 feet tall. 5 feet. But she lived her life and her accomplishments like a giant. Harriet was called upon to assist during the Civil War, the Union Army. And the reason she was called upon is because she had this innate ability to understand navigation. She knew how to read the stars. She knew that that North Star meant north. She also knew that that Big Dipper meant north. And, you know, the likes of the military knew this about her. And she decided that she wanted to assist with a raid that was taking place at the Combahee River in Beaufort, South Carolina. And she was a spy. She was a nurse, a cook. She learned healing properties from her mother as a little girl growing up, but it was a successful raid. And during that raid, Harriet Tubman commanded the troops, the first woman to command a military troop, and they were successful in freeing 700 slaves. But again, her ability to read and navigate was so paramount throughout her life. She was a naturalist. Harriet Tubman would rather work outside than to perform domestic duties, work, because that's where she suffered the most brutality as a child. I will share this with you. She was often loaned out to other slave owners in the community. And at the age of 5, 6, she was given types of tasks such as raising or helping to tend to a little baby, a knee baby, a baby. And she's a baby herself. So she was told that her main goal was to keep the baby quiet, the baby from crying. Well, as adults, it's hard. A baby is hungry, is wet, whatever. But every time the baby would cry, Harriet was punished, and it was by the hand of a whip. She was whipped often because of something that she couldn't control. So when she had an opportunity to work outside, that's what she did. And she stuck very close to her father. Her father was an expert timber harvester, so he taught her the trade. And she had her own oxen team. She understood that at that time, the waterways that were used for transferring the timber would be a way for her to also find out and communicate on opportunities for freedom. And we are very proud, myself and my colleague here, Jess, because we're representing the 2 historic sites that were proclaimed to honor her legacy. And the park that I'm at is in Church Creek, Maryland, the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Historical Park. And then our sister park is the Harriet Tubman National Historic Park in Auburn, New York. So Chris has already shared with you information about it's a beautiful visitor center. You walk in and you can still smell the fresh paint. And we opened the doors in 2017. But this page, I'm not really going to go through it line by line, but this really kind of tells you how we came into existence. It was during President Obama's administration through a proclamation. The Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Monument was established. And then that following year, Congress passed legislation, which was great because we got funding to be able to open the museum in Church Creek and the one in New York. So we were both on the same legislation. Now, we have the monument and the historical park based on what I just shared with you, but we manage them as a single unit under the National Park System. So I just wanted to share this with you. This is a map that gives you an idea of the monument boundary. You see the green line? That's the monument. And as Chris was mentioning earlier, right in here is where the visitor center is. Now, see this yellow line? This is Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge property. So we are embedded within their property. And through an interagency agreement that we have with them, we are able to accomplish any type of archaeological studies that we'd like to do, any type of interpretation that we would like to conduct. So it works very well. And then as you can see, the striped lines, these are other historic sites that are privately owned. And based on our legislation, if any of those individuals who own those properties would like to sell them to the Park Service, we would be interested in that. However, it just allows us the opportunity for acquisition in the future, if that's the route we want to take. So just want to give you an idea of the landscape there. So as Chris mentioned, we are uniquely situated. So the National Park Service, we do not, well, let me back up. We own 480 acres, which is the Jacob Jackson home site. And I meant to show you that on this slide. It's this area right here. Jacob Jackson was a free Black man who was friends with the Ross family. He was very, very good friends with Harriet Tubman's mother and father. And then, of course, he helped to assist Harriet throughout her pursuits. So, but the property that I was showing you that's in our border, that is property, again, that's within Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge. So we don't own it, but it is our boundary. Let's see. And because we are located at the visitor center, that is property that is owned by the state, we do co-manage and share in the operations of the visitor center. And again, this section right here, this talks about Maryland Department of Natural Resources. There's 17 acres. And of course, what I mentioned above, our cooperative management agreement with them. And then we are also partnered with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge. Now, we are both part of the Department of Interior, so we have an interagency agreement to work together. So the connection between Harriet Tubman and landscapes, it really is a no-brainer for us because she was a naturalist. If she were living today, she would recognize that landscape right there. Now, she may be shocked as to what's happening with regards to sea level rise and the erosion that's taken place in the region, but she would recognize those landscapes. One thing I noticed that she was proud of, and that's the quote up there in the corner, "My home, after all, was down in Maryland." Even though it was very difficult for her growing up as a child and as a young adult in Maryland, she still was very proud of her home. So I wanted to take just a few minutes to talk about a little bit more about the landscape and their dynamics. We do have a natural resource condition assessment that was conducted and completed in 2019 on our site. And those are the 4 specific indicators that were studied: air quality, water resources, biological integrity, and then landscape dynamics. And because we are talking about that connection between the landscapes and her legacy, I just wanted to really kind of focus on that. The landscapes are very rich in historical content. And yes, we have forests that are, they do provide dominant cover for other types of habitat that live within those forests. That picture that's right there is just an example of the marshland that's near Parsons Creek. It is an area that is located over near the Jacob Jackson site that I had mentioned to you. So it is very marshy. We do have uplands, which are your drier areas, and then we have the marshland. And because of what's happening with sea level rise, we're hoping that we can hold on to that as much as we can before it turns to open water. So as I mentioned before, that's the front cover of our natural resource condition assessment. It was a collaboration of the National Park Service, Maryland State Parks, and then geologists from the University of Richmond and University of Maryland. So again, it's helpful for us because it's our footprint and allows us to determine what type of stewardship resources we need to look into to do the best that we can to help mitigate what we can as far as losing our landscape. So number 3, I think, is very important because prioritizing what we need to do is key. And at the end of my presentation, I'll be able to share with you a couple of projects that are going to be launched to help further our efforts. I love this picture of Harriet Tubman. because that's a beautiful dress that she has on. Yes, her specific use of the landscapes, and those are just a few that came to my mind. You know, of course, to escape slavery, her survival skills, as I mentioned earlier, escape domestic brutality, to learn trades, to earn her own money. That was a big, big deal, because when she got to a point where she understood how she could navigate what she was dealing with, she would loan her own self out and make her own money. And the most important thing was to learn the waterways. Yeah, she did. She emancipated herself in 1849, but she kept coming back and forth, I think like 13 times, to help free others. So with the landscapes, we have natural resources that are very important to us, that we hope that we're able to try and make sure that we can preserve them as well. We have bald eagles, because that whole Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge, 30-some thousand acres, it really is a haven for migratory birds. And but we have seen a recovery of the bald eagles. They were really in decline in the late 20th century, but they're surging back. I mean, they're our national bird. Interior dwelling birds like the brown thrasher, you know, we really want to see what we can do to protect those types of birds. And then there's the long-eared bats that are federally recognized, because again, they were starting to decline in numbers. And then we do have a non-native animal species, the Sitka deer. The thing with the Sitka deer is they are really, like I mentioned down here, they are overabundant in the area. And it is impacting the habitat. Could be, you know, I think we have a bit of a risk. They're smaller deer. But anyway, we want to make sure that we can do whatever we can do to protect our natural resources as well. Now, again, this is a little bit that talks about the wetlands. And we have, as I mentioned before, the wetlands provide an opportunity for stopover, for habitat, for nesting, breeding, the waterfowl. We're getting to a time of the year where we will see they will just converge upon the area, and it's just an amazing sight to see. We also have to remember our aquatic wildlife and the different species of fish that we have in the wetlands. And I think one of the most difficult things for me to see is that picture down there in the bottom right corner. We are losing our trees because of a non-invasive species or plant called Phragmites. They just have taken over everything. And we've tried to beat them back. We've worked with Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge, but they're impacting not just the trees, but, you know, our friends, our wildlife in the water. And some of that Phragmite can grow as tall as 10 feet. You know, it's tough. Now, this is a busy slide, but I did want to talk just a little bit about sea level rise. And this is a snapshot of some data that was collected on the historic park. And this data is being studied to move forward with, like I had mentioned earlier, some efforts that will be taking place here within the next year or two. But yeah, the sea level, I mean, it's rising. And this particular chart right here, this is data that was collected from 1943, and it was tagged every 10 years. They looked at data over a course of 10 years, because I think that's, I'm sorry, it's a little blurry to me. I think it's 2020. So not too long ago. But as you can see to the right of that, it indicates that since 1943, sea level rise, it's been 1 foot at the park. And that's a lot. And you'll see what I mean by looking at the next slide that I go to. This one down here, I'm just going to hit a few things here. This is the Jacob Jackson site that I was talking about, that yellow box, and this green line is our boundary. And this map shows our current water levels, and then this one it shows that our water levels are rising by 2 feet, and then this one is by 5 feet, and it's based on what I'm going to show you next. So it's happening very, very quickly. Let's see. How is sea level rise impacting the historic site? I kind of mentioned that a bit earlier. We can't stop it, but we can try to slow it down. And we do have some wonderful partners who are working with us, that will be working with us on that, because there's too much at stake. The facilities that have been built by Chris and his team are just exquisite, and people come from all over, from other countries. Our first year that we were open, we were open from March through December, and we had over 100,000 visitors from 50 countries. So we want to make sure that we're able to do what we can do to preserve it. And this is just a snapshot of what I was talking about. So this is sea level rise that's affecting marshes in the Harriet Tubman National Monument area. So this is what we currently look like. And you can take a look at the legend to kind of correspond with these colors here. This is 2050, which is not too far away. And you can start to see right here, between here, these two, transitional salt and flooded marsh, you're starting to see where that's picking up. And then by the end of the century, look at that. It's just encroaching all over. So, it is what it is, and we'll just do the best that we can to see how we can help with that. These are the 2 points that I mentioned earlier. We are going to be working with National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers on a project entitled Preserving Coastal Parklands, Evaluating the Ecological, Cultural, and Financial Impacts of Native-Based Features to Inform Sea Level Rise Planning for the National Park Service. We received the funding for that from NOAA, and right now we're in the planning stages of that. And then the second one is the Coastal Hazards and Sea Level Assessment, Vulnerability Assessment. That too is going to help us. And we're working with Western Carolina University geologists who have, actually, they were the ones that helped to establish the snapshot that we had prior to this slide. So there's a lot of work that's going on. Again, these are just some pictures of inside the museum, Parsons Creek, Stewart's Canal, what it's known as, and the landscape. And I think Harriet would want us to do this. And I love this quote by her. God's time is always near. He set the North Star in the heavens. He gave me the strength in my limbs. He meant I should be free. And this was a quote that she made at the Women's Suffrage Convention in New York in 1859. So that is my presentation. This is how we can be contacted, our address, and then our social media addresses. So please feel free to reach out to us. We'd be more than happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deanna. I have so many questions. I'm very concerned about what's going to happen with the land. So we definitely want to talk about that in our Q&A and what can be done to save this land and property. Our last speaker before we start with our panel Q&A is Jessica Bowes, is the Cultural Resource Specialist, Women's Rights, and Harriet Tubman National Historical Parks. She has 2 Masters of Arts degrees in Historical Archaeology and Anthropology, and she's currently working on her PhD in Archaeology, focusing on research on Harriet Tubman, African American archaeology, and foodways. Jessica?
Thank you. I can talk about Tubman for probably 20 hours straight. So I had to write everything down. So I stick to the topic and the time we have. Because, I mean, I can talk about Tubman for days. I mean, any of us can. And I probably have with at least one of you. So thank you for having me here. And so we're going to take a trip. We've been in Maryland. We're going to move up into New York, and I'll explain why in a second here. But so if from the previous presentations, if we can think of Harriet Tubman's parks, the park in Maryland as serving as the landscape of Tubman's time enslaved, then the park sites in Auburn serve as the landscapes of her freedom. The National Park in Church Creek, Maryland encompasses vast acreage of the natural environment and successfully tells Tubman's story while not detracting from this environment. In fact, it does a beautiful job in interpreting the environment. And if you've never been there, and the first time I was in 2018, I got out of my car and I was like, yes, this is the landscape of Tubman. It just hits you. But in contrast, the national park sites in Auburn, New York find themselves actually in a built urban environment where the natural environment is limited, but there's a strong cultural landscape. So today I'll discuss how the Harriet Tubman National Historical Park in Auburn, New York is enhanced by this greater urban cultural landscape. And I know you got a little bit of background on Tubman a few times already, but I gotta go over some of it because we are moving from Dorchester County, Maryland, and this is not the route Tubman took, right? It is not linear. You remember Chris's talk, right? But if we're a bird, we're going up to Auburn. So we're in here, central New York. It's also known as the Finger Lakes region of New York. So in this condensed overview, we'll explain to you why I'm talking about Auburn, New York at all, because you might actually not know. So Tubman's born in Dorchester County in Maryland in 1822, self-emancipated in 1849. She's going to go first to Philadelphia by way of New Jersey. And while she's planning that first trip back to Maryland, right, she's going back to get her family members, the Fugitive Slave Act is passed. It's passed in 1850. And that essentially means that those northern states are no longer safe. And Tubman cannot bring her family to Philadelphia. She actually has to bring them into Canada where their freedom is secured. So she's going to instead, just think about that. Instead of coming up into Philadelphia, she's going to go all the way up into Canada, specifically St. Catharines in Ontario. She'll do 13 trips, bringing a known 70 people to freedom. And while doing this work, she's going to meet prominent Quaker Lucretia Mott and her circle of influential abolitionist women. So this is how we're going to get why, one of the first things we get asked in Auburn is like, why did Tubman come here? That's where powerful abolitionist women lived, and she wanted to be a part of that network. And this is just a great photo of Tubman with her family in front of her barn in Auburn. So it is through these connections that Harriet Tubman comes to purchase a 7-acre farm in central New York, which is actually this bottom piece here first, which she will expand to 32 acres. So this red outline is the largest her property will become. She purchases the home from abolitionist Frances Seward and her husband, New York Senator William Seward, who you might know would become the Secretary of State under Lincoln. The Seward family lived just a couple miles down the road from Tubman's new home and would remain a part of her network. So when Tubman finally arrives to her home, so she'll buy her home in 1859, but she's really not coming down until after the Civil War. When she wants to come back to Auburn, she's going to bring her family with her from Canada. Some have been there a decade, but they're going to come with her. Her parents, her brothers, their wives, and their children. And as well as others from that community will also follow Tubman to Auburn to their own homes. When Tubman arrives to Auburn, she's entering a city with an established Black community. As early as 1820, African Americans settled the Owasco River outlet on the eastern side of the city, the area labeled as New Guinea on this map. So that little map of Tubman that I showed you before, she's off map here. This one doesn't even extend that far because in 1834, it's not down that, Auburn hasn't expanded that far south yet. But you can see it's labeled New Guinea there. By 1850, the city's Black community moved north to Washington Street. So these folks aren't living in these houses anymore by 1850. The community's up here in Washington Street. And they're going to move there because that's where they built a new African-American school. And within that school is a new Methodist Episcopal Zion church. And then the home Tubman purchased is south of the city, outside which this map covers. And in fact, Tubman's home is so close to Auburn's southern border that it's actually in the next town, Fleming, New York. On many maps of Auburn, including that one before, you'll see that Tubman's property falling off the maps at the southern edge. And actually at its largest size, it straddles the town line. This is the town line. So, but why do we always talk about Auburn then and not Fleming, which is where she actually had property, right? So, while her home may have been geographically located in Fleming, New York, Tubman's daily life was lived in Auburn. She would have walked the neighborhoods north of her home regularly. The sites highlighted on this map show just some of Tubman's greater community, including several family members who had settled Auburn by 1871. So you can see some of the names of some of the family. The first local Amy Zion church on Washington Street, the Presbyterian church where she married her second husband, and the home of the Sewards. This map, though, is not comprehensive, as Tubman was ingrained in the community of Auburn. These are just some of the highlights. And just to compare, her house is even off map of this one. She's down here. And this is just a snapshot. This here is Fort Hill Cemetery. This is going to become just like a good geographical marker as we move through some of these maps. Okay, so then where's her park, right? So the Harriet Tubman National Historical Park consists of two locations, Tubman's residence and the historic AME Zion Church. So when this park was established by Congress and formally signed in 2017, the legislation designated a park partner, Harriet Tubman Home Incorporated. This nonprofit owns and operates the brick residence, and property that Harriet Tubman purchased in 1859, and the additional lands and structures she purchased to expand in 1895. So this is partner, much like the Maryland site, it's a partner park. So this is owned by the park's partner. That site, her home and her lands and her farm is incredibly interesting, and it has its own landscape considerations. But I'm actually just going to be briefly discussing it within the broader community context, which is the focus for today. And the next location is the historic AME Zion Church, the site of which was the site of Tubman's funeral, and its associated parsonage on Parker Street in Auburn. You're going to hear me say Parker Street a few times. And that's where the congregation moved to when they outgrew the Washington Street site. So this is the church and parsonage is about here, and Harriet's grave here. Just for to orient you, this is Fort Hill Cemetery. So it's really close by. So the Washington Street AME Zion Church was inside the school, and the congregation grew, and they quickly expanded. And so they're going to purchase a new piece of land to build a new church there in 1891. And that's the national park site. So that's here. So the half acre, it's just a tiny little piece of property, is owned and operated solely by the National Park Service, and as such, the focus of what I'll discuss today. The church was built in 1891. So that's 32 years after Tubman arrived in Auburn. She's already part of this community. She's going to help establish this church. And the parsonage was constructed in 1910, and that's the parsonage there. This, I don't know when this photo is, post-lightning strike. The bell tower was struck by lightning in 2019. So probably the winter going into 2020. This is, I mentioned park owned. We are restoring it, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So the area where the church now stands west of Fort Hill Cemetery were farm fields until the construction of homes on small neighborhood plots in the 1870s. When the AME Zion Church purchased the half-acre lot to build a new church in 1891, moving it from Washington Street, the original plan was to build a modest Greek Revival church, pictured here on this side. However, financial constraints due to labor and supply costs required the building committee to pivot, and ultimately a Queen Anne-style church, like the one over there, was built. And these are from a catalog of Methodist churches, which didn't know existed. Very cool. So the elements that make, and this is a historic photo of the church. Here's the church and the parsonage, and then the neighborhood street there, which comes into play. The elements making it a Queen Anne style church include a clipped gable, alternating fish scale and dogtooth shingles, bracketed triangular entrance pediment, and rectangular rather than segmental arch windows. I had to mention, because we are in a building museum, mention the buildings. So notably, Queen Anne style structures were popular throughout Auburn. It's a really beautiful city. There's a lot of really great architecture, but not along Parker Street, right? Parker Street had been settled now for about 20 years when this one is built, but it's mostly vernacular gable front and L-plan homes, which you can kind of see on repeat moving down the street. The parsonage was not added until 1910. It does not take on any elements of the church. That's the one here, and is broadly an American four-square style home. So the church is well situated, right? It was with walkable access to Fort Hill Cemetery. This access was used on the day of Tubman's funeral and internment. Her casket was carried out the front door of the church, across the culvert and curbstone, across Parker Street and open lots, which were here, to her final resting place in Fort Hill Cemetery, which is up here. So this even makes it look longer than it is. It's actually a short walk. Today, Fort Hill Cemetery is fenced, and there are homes here, so we can't get there. Maybe one day. But you can see how small the property is of the church and parsonage. So Tubman died of pneumonia on March 10th, 1913, and her services at the AME Zion Church on March 13th, 3 days later, drew in hundreds to pay their respects. The images here of her funeral show the exit from the church. So this is them coming out that front door, going across the culvert here, and then her internment at Fort Hill Cemetery. So as noted, Parker Street was starting to be developed prior to the construction of the church. 8 homes were constructed in the 1870s and 1880s and were owned by African Americans, meaning the church was intentionally constructed within an expanding Black community. It wasn't happenstance that they bought a half acre on Parker Street. Many of the homes built in the late 19th century in these neighborhoods are still standing. A lot of those homes are original and are still there. So these ones that sweep down the street here, but also in some of the connecting streets as well. 6 of the homes that we know of for sure were continuously owned and occupied by African-American families from the late 19th century through to the 21st century, and that's current as of 2005, and it could still be today. We just don't have up-to-date data. And Tubman's descendants still live in several of these homes. So her descendants, her great-grandnieces and great-great-grandnephews live in Auburn, many still in some of these original homes. It is within this community context, then, that the landscapes of Harriet Tubman National Historical Park in Auburn are situated. So this map here is from 2005 study on the Freedom Trail in Cayuga County, where Auburn is located. Over 100 sites associated with connections to the Underground Railroad, abolitionism, and African-American life were documented by a team of researchers. Of those, 66 were in Auburn, the purple dots on this map, and there are likely others. The yellow box in the center is Fort Hill Cemetery to better orient you on the map. So this is Parker Street. Look at all those dots. And then this is Chapman and Garrow Streets nearby. So this is a neighborhood. Interestingly, this growth and geographical shift in the African-American community, right? We saw in New Guinea, and then up in Washington Street, and now down towards Parker Street. It follows Tubman's presence and influence. Though I do not intend to suggest that she created this community, she's certainly impacting it. We can see how several of the homes outlined in green, those clusters, were owned by Tubman's family members or individuals she helped bring to freedom. Even today, some of the homes are still owned, as I mentioned. Further, Tubman utilized her network to fundraise on behalf of the Parker Street Church over the last 2 decades of her life. So the church itself is another place that Tubman influenced. So this purple dot is the church. But the structures around it, as well as over here on these streets, and then a little bit closer. And then this, remember falling off the map, is Tubman's property down here. Actually, these two are structures on her property, and this is her brother. So all of these dots are directly connected for Tubman, right? We don't, we can spiral that further out. So in her book, The Geography of Resistance, Cheryl LaRoche states that the pillars of the Black Underground Railroad movement are family, church, and community. And that's kind of reminded me to Chris, what you had at the end, and you're right, family, faith, and community. Family, church, and community, right? Pillars of the Black Underground Railroad movement. It is easy to see how these pillars for the quest for freedom that were integral in the success of freedom seekers are then mapped onto the Black community in Auburn following emancipation, right? Family, church, and community, right? It's the church on Parker Street, Tubman's relatives moving in and around and creating and being a part of an existing community. So the National Park Service, we're a federal entity. Our boundaries are fixed, those red outlines on that have carried through the maps I've shared. But the cultural landscape in which the park sits is boundless and fluid. It means the park is inherently a part of a community outside of its legislative limits. This serves as both a challenge as well as an opportunity. While it's true that much of the integrity of Parker Street and the greater neighborhood is still intact, right? This tree is blocking us, but this picture carries through. Those homes that you see there carry through past the parsonage. This may not always be the case. Urban landscapes are often the sites of frequent change over time due to development, fast-changing needs of the city, particularly times of population growth. We're fortunate that these residential areas of Auburn were able to escape urban renewal in the 1950s, but this may not always be true, as external threats are always at play. For instance, private homeowners may not have the ability, the resources, or the desire to continue to preserve these sites, right? Home renovations, changing and modifying and losing that landscape element is outside of the National Park Service control. Further, urban parks sometimes face challenges when sites are dotted amongst other private and public lands. So the National Park Service sites in Auburn being 2 pieces that are split in the town, the church and then Tubman's residence. These can be seen as barriers or deterrent to visitors. People may not want to travel beyond one stop or the main attraction. But this is also where an opportunity arises, and one actually where the Park Service can work with the greater community to step outside its boundaries and to help tell these stories. And indeed, this is actually how the park has been operating over the past several years. So the historic church and parsonage have undergone foundational studies and restoration work that informed the restoration work, which started in May of this year. Right? So these documents, like the Cultural Landscape Report and the Historic Structure Report, these inform how we restore this, right? What did it look like at the time of Tubman's funeral? And then that work, had some impacts, right? COVID impacted a lot of construction, but now that work is ongoing as of May this year. And actually, we're testing some paint colors on the church right now. But during this work, park operations were still happening. People wanted to come see Tubman's parks, Tubman's sites. So park operations were conducted in partnership with the Harriet Tubman home and with the city of Auburn, and included walking and trolley tours, taking visitors to these landscapes. So stops included the site of New Guinea, the Seward home, the Tubman residence, the historic church on Parker Street, and Tubman's grave site, and even many of the sites of the abolitionists and community members that were dotted in purple along the map earlier. So bringing visitors to Auburn who, they show up. This is at the Equal Rights Heritage Center in Auburn, a center built by the state, and they see a park ranger there, and they're going to go on a 2-hour walking tour, and they're going to cross into those landscapes. And those are outside of the Park Service, but they're so relevant to the story. So all that to say, the Harriet Tubman National Historical Park is made stronger by the continued presence of the community in the cultural landscape. When the park is able to open the church and parsonage, possibly as early as next summer, it'll just be another step towards preservation, towards sharing these stories. Those are my citations. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to invite our speakers back up so that we can have an opportunity to ask some questions and to have some conversation going. Chris Elcock, if you can come on back up, and Deanna Mitchell and Jessica Bowles. If we can give them another round of applause. It was just excellent.
Okay.
All right, excellent. There's also a mic that's in the back, so if you do have a question, we would appreciate when you stand up, just hold your hand up, and we'll bring the mic to you because we are recording. We want to make sure that we capture your question. So then I will start, and my question is for Jessica. Are there any plans being made to do a direct connection between what's happening in New York and what's happening here in Maryland? Like bus tours for people to go up, to be able to stay there, to really feel the whole experience?
Actually, Deanna, you might know more, be able to speak more to that. I mean, there's certainly sister parks, and they're certainly connected and the ties are there. But to speak for the Auburn Park, there is so much foundational work that we still need to do, including something called a foundation document that actually helps us guide what we're doing. So bureaucratically speaking, that could be a thing, but it is not in the discussions at the moment that I'm aware of.
I know there are a lot of groups, and I've seen them on TikTok and Facebook, and they're like, we're going to walk the path that Harriet Tubman walked. I think there was a man who just finished walking 400 miles. I wonder what kind of job he had to be able to take that time off. But do you see that, Chris, that people really want to get their hands in the dirt, so to speak, to try to walk as far as they can to experience it?
Yeah, I would say so. I think one of the most moving experiences I've had since we've opened was a young lady waiting for her aunt to finish that little walk that we did. And, so we were waiting, chatting and waiting for her aunt to finish. And then I realized her aunt was in a walker. And her aunt said, if Harriet could go all that distance, I can go this distance. And so, yes, there is that kind of need. There is that interest. This portion of history no one thought was important for such a long time that, we have to sort of try to create and hold on to what little bits we do have.
Which leads to Deanna, because part of what we saw in your presentation, which was alarming to me, to think about what's happening with the water erosion and the fact that you said, we're doing the best we can. We can't reverse it. We can just kind of hold back the tide as long as we can. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And what does that mean in terms of, as you said, when you get into 2100, what it's going to look like potentially?
Yeah, it's a little alarming, and it's real. It's reality. And, we have a way within the National Park Service of stepping up to the challenge, however, and it's going to take technology. For instance, NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, they are working with technology now that can really take a look down into the beds of the oceans and the streams and the rivers to see how there might be a way to impact and slow the progress. So it takes a village to do this, and we're looking forward to working with those scientists and engineers who have ideas of how they might be able to help us.
And Chris, would you be kind enough to hand Deanna your mic? There's a little ticking noise off of her mic. Maybe that might be better. I want to just turn toward the audience. If you do have a question, please raise your hand and we'll get the microphone to you. Thank you.
And real quick, I just want to say that we will alternate between in-person audience questions and our virtual questions.
Okay.
Drake Wilson with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. for you, Chris. Considering all of the expected problems you're going to have with water, why were the buildings established at grade? And do you have any features that dewater the site?
Yeah, great question. I should have mentioned it earlier, but the entire 17 acres is graded upwards. So the visitor center is actually on a plateau. It's at elevation 7.25, if I remember correctly. So we're 7.25 feet above sea level at the point of where the visitor center is. It's not something that the audience or that you can discern over that length of time, but the Maryland Park Service and the National Park Service as well, went through great lengths. We had to sort of shrink the size of the building. We had to, take the project budget and modify it such that we could create, or at least within the boundaries that we had, elevate the buildings as much as possible. So we exceeded state criteria, we exceeded federal criteria, and I suspect that's how then that project became sort of a springboard for the Coast Smart Council, which is a Maryland look at sea level rise considerations.
Other questions from the audience, or will we take the mic back for the questions that are coming across the web? If so, just let me know.
We have, excuse me, that is very loud. We have one question from our virtual audience. Janet has asked a question that I believe applies to the Church Creek, Maryland site, but might apply to both. We'll hear from our panelists. She's interested in understanding the impact that the landscape setting has on visitors and whether the intention, I believe, with the visitor center and that communication with the landscape is realized. Has any visitor responses been gathered or any post-occupancy evaluations been taken?
You start.
So, is that better?
Yes.
Okay. So, one of the things that we try to ensure that we do is listen to what our visitors have to say about their experience there. As Chris mentioned, the area in which the visitor center is located, there's not a lot of marshy, boggy type of landscape. However, if you get further out into the outer areas, perimeters of the visitor center, that's when you get into the wetlands and the forests and those types of things. So the visitors are not out in those particular areas at this time. The Jacob Jackson home site, which is the 480 acres that I had mentioned during my presentation, we have an opportunity to look at that is in the forest, to take a look and see if there's any way that we could provide visitor services in that particular area. But at this time, when visitors come to the site, they get their experience at the visitor center. And we've not really heard anything from visitors with regards to any type of concerns.
There's a question here. Mm-hmm.
So we visited the museum 2 years ago before COVID. I can't remember exactly when. Yeah. Is this better? Yes.
Yes.
And my question is the museum, are the exhibits going to change? In other words, that museum is sort of purpose-built to tell that story, and so the exhibits were developed to tell the story. So if the story hasn't changed, do you imagine that the exhibits will change, or that they'll just be updated, or maybe there'll be new information that'll be incorporated?
Yeah.
And I'd like to say,
Go ahead.
just a gorgeous setting, terrific buildings, great job. There it is out in the middle of this part of Maryland, and we were visiting friends and we were wowed.
Yes, thank you for saying that. Yeah, oftentimes, I'll qualify it by saying it's not a museum because we don't have any artifacts that require any conditioning. So we like to, we oftentimes like to we are more comfortable with it being called an interpretive center. But be that as it may, oftentimes with interpretive centers, you will find that the exhibits will be updated, or there will be a need to update the exhibits in probably 7 to 10 years. I would also say that yes, very much that is the intention, was that the story would expand and that there would be more content. In fact, when we were doing the exhibits, there was an image of Harriet Tubman when she was probably, I think they think she is in her late 20s when that photograph was taken. That didn't exist when we started. And so wanting to sort of peel back, press pause and get that into the exhibits was a priority. Then we have this story about this, hope, about the $20 bill. So there are places and there are opportunities for the story to expand. And there are more things that we're discovering all the time. There's a site, I haven't seen it, but I know that some people know where it is exactly, where her parents, the site where her parents, her parents' home was. And so there are more stories to come online.
So is your firm still involved with the site?
No, not at this time. As architects, we design the building, then we give it to the public, and we hope to be invited back.
Can we make sure that we have the mic? I know his first question was your firm still involved? But we want to make sure everyone can hear.
Yeah. The exhibit designers were Haley Sharp Design. So they were one of the consultants on the job.
Other questions? Yes.
Yes. So we have a question about the new visitor center. Given the concerns with climate change and sea level rise that Deanna raised, we had some questions about whether sustainability was taken into account with the design of the visitor center and how it, might be designed for the future.
Well, I mean, short of raising the building beyond the thresholds of the projections that we had at the time, I don't know if there's anything else I could add besides that. I mean, sustainability has its own umbrella of questions, and the building is LEED silver, but I'm not sure that was the line of the question so much.
Maybe we can move to the next question and we can just get a little bit more clarity on that person's question. Yes, sir.
So I'm interested in archaeological studies conducted on the Maryland site. Have any notable artifacts been found?
Yes, thank you for asking that question. There was an archaeological study conducted in 2017 at the Jacob Jackson site. And one of the things that was really difficult for the team was it was in the middle of summer and there were chiggers and bugs everywhere, right? Yes, there were some artifacts that were unearthed and we were excited about it. And those artifacts do not reside at the park. Their repository is in our museum center that's in Boston, Massachusetts. There wasn't a whole lot. I think we had about 20 artifacts that were discovered. However, they didn't get to complete the entire study. So another study, we got funding. We found out about this about 6 months ago. We got additional funding for another study that's going to be done in 2023. Because one of the things that we really, really want to try to do is find the footprint of the Jacob Jackson home site, his farmhouse, where he and his wife and his children lived. He was a veterinarian. And during that time, for an African American to have that type of profession was unheard of. So we really want to be able to see if they're successful in not just finding the footprint of the farmhouse, but whatever else is out there that we would love to be able to add to this wonderful legacy.
Wonderful. There's a question up front.
Yeah, so we got some feedback about the earlier question about sustainability. I believe it was two-pronged, so you addressed both sides, Chris, with the LEED Silver designation, as well as the inability to move the building necessarily should sea levels rise.
And we have a question up front.
Hello. I think this probably applies mainly to the Maryland site, but equally perhaps to the New York site. Have you done any work on investigating the indigenous population in the area? And if so, is that reflected in the visitor center or interpretive center?
I don't recall exactly. I think that the site that we're on, a piece of an arrowhead was found, and that was given to the local Indigenous Peoples Society, but it was a fragment. I think that was all that was found in Maryland. I can't say for New York.
Yeah, so actually, if you'll remember those maps, I kept pointing out Fort Hill Cemetery. In fact, Tubman is buried in Fort Hill Cemetery. The first person in Fort Hill Cemetery wasn't even buried there until 1851. It's called Fort Hill because there's this huge mound there that had always been there. And when Europeans came, or when the Europeans arrived kind of following the American Revolution, if you're familiar with the northeastern United States, right, the revolution ends and sort of all these big tracts of land are given over to whoever was generals or whatever, right? And that's where a lot of these places get their names. And there was this mound, and it's the Europeans who called it a fort. But it's actually probably related to the Cayuga. So Auburn's in Cayuga County, and it was the Cayuga settled that Owasco River and the Owasco River outlet there. That was a huge Cayuga settlement. So the native history, while now Auburn is a sprawling city, it's there, it's a part of it. In terms of how the park interprets it, not at all. But the greater community does talk about the role of the Cayuga and kind of European settlement displacing the Cayuga and bringing in lands there. Yeah.
And so I have a question for everyone, just as we're beginning to wrap up. So we will have one more question. If you have one, please raise your hand. But this is the kind of spiritual work where you get really connected to the history, depending upon how you enter the project. I've been on a number of Harriet Tubman panels, studies, have read, and every time I walk away with more information, not just about Harriet Tubman, but also about myself experiencing Harriet Tubman at this time, trying to not see her through 21st century eyes. And so I want to ask each one of you, based upon your experience, like, what did you learn new about Harriet Tubman's study by doing the work that you did? Emily can ask, you can start, whoever would ever like to start.
Where do we start, right?
I can jump in. So it was mentioned in my bio and I didn't get into it, but I started doing archaeology at the Harriet Tubman's residence, her brick home and residence, that partner site. What year is this? In maybe 2010, 2011. And I've done quite a few archaeological digs there, and my dissertation is on her food and the way her and her household's family plays out through food. So I loved the quote you had, Deanna, about, Maryland's her home. And so what, dissertation's not done yet, but what I'm seeing is essentially this Maryland identity being brought to New York, which is what anyone would do, right? Those foods of your life and your comfort. And I think, you mentioned the spiritual component to the sites, but if you haven't been to Auburn, New York, this is a great time. Finger Lakes, they're beautiful. There's a lot of wineries there if you like wine. And when people come to the Tubman site, and especially if they start at her brick residence, this is a home she purchased and where she spent the majority of her life. She lived in that home and that land for the majority of her life. There's a moment you have when you're there. It's just this moment of being there. And every visitor has that. And I had that as an archaeologist. And I also had a crushing panic attack when I was thinking, my God, why am I responsible for this? This woman is so magnanimous, and now I got to do right by her. But at the same time, I think that the thing I learned, though, most is her humanity. So, and I've tried to carry this through with my work, is to remind folks, and I've done tours at the site and I've done talks before, is that she might seem mythic, but she was human. And I really try to do that when we get children at the site, because it's not unattainable. The what she gave to the world, if we can all give like a little bit of that, and we can, right? We'd all be better off for it. It's not that crazy. So the humanizing component. I think last thing I'll also say is something that I think is so important about the Auburn sites, is that Tubman is drawn into that area because of powerful women. And that, so people will say, why'd you come to Auburn? Was it just like totally free? Everyone's an abolitionist, or, it was tumultuous like it is today, right? There's not this ubiquitous kind of universal feeling of support, but there were powerful people who could connect and they could form a network, and Tubman knew that, and she was brilliant. So she's like, this is where I need to be to do the things that I think are important, and I need to connect with these folks, and we can all help each other. And they all kind of recognized it. And it was all primarily through women, right? The land she bought was not, William Seward sold it because he was a man, but it was Francis Seward's inheritance, right? So it was through his wife and that Tubman came to own that land. So those are, for me, the kind of the role women played in Tubman's greater life, and the fact that she is a human. She's mythic and she did great things, but she had very real, relatable struggles. Folks will come to folks will come on tour and they'll be like, oh, well, so Frederick Douglass, he writes his books and he goes around, he makes all this money. Tubman had money, right? Absolutely not. She was never, ever, ever financially secure. She was always financially precarious. And there's a letter William Seward writes where, and this is part of it, because she cared so greatly for so many. He said, I gave Tubman $5 today. I told her to keep it for herself. I know she won't. And it's paraphrasing. It's not a direct quote. But, and to the point where she's her heart's growing and she's taking care of folks. But, she's never benefiting. She's never learned to read or write. She's not,
Right.
and she's a woman, right? So there's all these other disadvantages that will prevent her from that kind of same sort of financial gain that some of the other folks have, despite being, world famous, right? She was world famous.
Tough one to follow, right? Yeah. So I'll say two things. I would say the first thing I will say is that, for us in our office and for me personally as a designer, we don't start anywhere near drawing anything. Our process starts with reading and learning and trying to immerse yourselves as much as possible. And so for those of you who enjoy reading, this might sound unusual, but there is a fictional book by James McBride called Song Yet Sung. Mm-hmm. Okay? And this book, the story is, as I understand it, he wrote this book. He happened to go to the Eastern Shore, and the landscapes were so convincing that he delayed the rest of his trip. He spent more time in that landscape, and then this book came out of him about this mythical Tubman figure. So it's a really wonderful book to read. And then for me as a designer, I could see the landscape, I could feel the colors, so it was a really interesting and sensory experience, not directly related to her, but sort of coming out of her story. And then the other thing I would say is that I learned, or that I take with me, is there's a lot more heartbreak to her story than you might imagine. Mm-hmm. She was enslaved and she married a man that was free. It didn't make any sense because their children would have been enslaved, because those are the rules at the time. So she had to have had some kind of they had to have some kind of magic to that relationship. Why would a free person do this? And then ultimately, when one of the times she came back, she asked him to come. And he said no. And then I mentioned it before, her coming back, trying to get all of her siblings, and she didn't get one of them. Rachel died before she could get her. And so, throughout all of these escape stories, which seem, exciting sometimes, and the stuff of movies that we watch and we enjoy. There's a lot more heartbreak. There's so much humanity to her story. There's so much loss in her story that it's quite striking.
Deanna?
Wow. No,
Right.
listen, I echo my colleagues here on the stage. I came to the Harriet Tubman Museum, and I feel I was really blessed to be able to be chosen for the superintendent position, but I came from Tuskegee. I was the site manager for the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site in Tuskegee, Alabama. And I was charged with standing that park up from the ground. Haley Sharp was a part of the design team.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And so here I am at another park that I'm standing up from the ground, and it's Harriet Tubman, who my mom was born on the Eastern Shore. So I grew up in the northern part of Maryland, and of course she moved to the northern part of Maryland where she met my father. But I knew of Harriet Tubman growing up as a little girl because mom always knows about home, right? Mama always knows about home. And I didn't know everything about her, but I knew about her. And I had a pin that my mother gave me, a Harriet Tubman pin that was fashioned after the first United States stamp series of Harriet, I think it was African American history, and I don't remember what year. It was like 1970 something. And I had this pin, and I still have that pin. And when I got the position, I remember going through my jewelry box, and every day I'd walk out that door in my uniform, I put on that pin, because I never dreamed that I would be around her area where she grew up, where she cut her teeth, where she toiled, where she cried, where she found and truly embraced her spirituality, because she was a very, very faithful woman. God was her light, and the music, the spirituals that you would find through the communities that came over on those slave ships, which were African rhythms that eventually evolved into spirituals, they meant so much to her. That was a way in which she had comfort and hope. And not only that, but it provided an opportunity for communication, because that was the way that slaves would communicate with each other. Making sure you're at the corn crib at 10 o'clock through song, right? So I guess for me, just the journey that I've been on as a little child to now, and being there and being charged with helping to secure this legacy and to ensure that it is for the whole world to experience, is what I find very, very special about Harriet Tubman.
Thank you very much. I like to think that Harriet Tubman also had joy. I know we talk a lot about the heartbreak. I mean, she went back. To think about the strength it took to go back, to ask your free-born husband to come with you. And he doesn't just say no, he's already remarried. Let's be very clear. She got back, he had remarried. So girlfriend's like, okay, fine, bet, I'm rolling.
But the fact that she invites them too. She's like, all right, we'll bring her.
Bring her. Everybody, let's go to freedom. But that takes an incredible strength. People talk about how she married again, and maybe part of it she married because he was receiving a bit of a pension, so there was some financial stability. But I like to think along the way, maybe she married for love as well. Like to kind of think that all Black women do is struggle and have heartbreak and carry the world on our back. I like to think that in the midst of all that, there's some joy, there's some love, there's some laughter. She had her father, she had her mother, she got them to freedom. Like to me, there's got to be something other than just the struggle. The fact that she outlived the people that owned her, like to me, Harriet Tubman has a lot more than just pain, that there's a lot of joy and love too, that I think we want to remind young people of, that, you know, there's pain, but there's also joy. There's struggle, but there's also family and love. And for her to get to a point up in Auburn and have the family members there and people she got to freedom surrounding her, there's got to be a point where she probably sat down and looked out and said, okay, this is a good thing here. Like, this is a good day right now that I got people from slavery to freedom and I'm still here to witness it. That to me is very powerful. We want to end the program now, but we are going to have time to speak with all of our speakers here. I know people still have questions. Please come up. Once again, let me remind you of who's up here. Chris Elcock, who's an associate principal at GWWO Architects. We are excited about the work you've done. Thank you for that, taking us through that struggle. Deanna Mitchell has served the past 5 years as superintendent of the Harriet Tubman National Historical Park in Church Creek, Maryland. I'm so very concerned about the waterways. I will be staying in touch with you.
Yes.
I may not be here in 2100, but I want to be able to support. Thank you so much, Deanna.
Yes, we'll figure it out.
And Jessica Bowles, the Cultural Resource Specialist for Women's Rights and Harriet Tubman National Historical Parks. We look forward to your dissertation being done, because a PhD done is a good PhD, but we're excited about the work around food. Thank you so much, Jessica. And I will invite Jacqueline to come back up.
Thank you so much, everyone. And so I mentioned that Kaye and I have known each other for quite some time when I was up here before. And Kaye actually taught my teacher certification class when I became a high school social studies teacher way back in the day, many years ago. So young. But one of the things that Kaye taught us was the importance of context within history. And I think that is what has come out in this program, the importance of context. We all kind of know who Harriet Tubman is, but knowing her context, knowing the landscapes, gives us a deeper understanding of who she is and what she means to us, both individually and as Americans. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, indeed.
So as we said in the beginning, this program is part of a larger series called Intersections, where we are exploring the work and perspectives of Black designers and issues of social justice and equity through the lens of design. This week is kind of our Black History Week. And on Friday, we will be looking at the memorial to enslaved laborers at UVA with the incredible designer and architect Mabel Wilson. So we encourage you all to join us on Friday for that program and to also come back throughout the fall for other Intersections programs. So thank you so much for being here. We have a reception outside in our great hall, so please join us for that, and thank you.
Thanks for coming.